Have you ever wondered what you'd do if everyone you trusted betrayed you at once? Would you fight back or would you give up? By the end of this story, you'll know exactly what it takes to win against impossible odds. They all thought I was finished. The judge was against me, and my ex-wife was already celebrating.
They all thought I was finished. The judge was against me, and my ex-wife was already celebrating, but I refused to bow down. I used every ounce of intelligence and patience I had, and I turned their game upside down. I exposed her greed for everyone to see, and in the end, she left the courtroom with nothing but shame. Well, I walked out with justice. My name is David Mitchell, and 3 years ago, I thought I had everything figured out. I was a successful software engineer in Austin, Texas, married to Sarah for 12 years, with two beautiful children, Emma, 10, and Jake, 8. We lived in a comfortable suburban home, took family vacations, and from the outside, we looked like the perfect American family. The perfection is often just an illusion. The cracks in our marriage started small. Sarah began working late more often, her phone became password protected, and intimate conversations became rare. I threw myself into my work, developing security software for major corporations, telling myself that every successful marriage goes through rough patches. Then came the night that shattered my world. I came home early from a business trip, excited to surprise my family. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed a Mercedes I didn't recognize parked across the street. The house was unusually quiet, and Sarah's car wasn't in the garage. I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, my heart pounding with an inexplicable dread. What I found there would haunt me forever. Sarah was in our bed with Richard Blackwood, her divorce attorney and supposedly my friend. They were so engrossed they didn't hear me enter. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching my marriage crumble in real time. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound could have. I quietly backed out, grabbed my phone, and did what my analytical mind told me to do. I documented everything. Photos, timestamps, even a brief video. Then I drove to a nearby coffee shop and sat there for hours, trying to process what had just happened. When Ashley returned home, Sarah acted as if nothing had occurred. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about my trip, and helped the kids with their homework. The normalcy felt surreal, almost insulting, but I said nothing. Something inside me knew I needed to be strategic about this moment. That night, as I lay next to the woman who had betrayed me, listening to her peaceful breathing, I made a decision that would define the next chapter of my life. I wouldn't confront her immediately, I wouldn't explode in anger or make rash decisions. Instead, I would gather information, understand the full scope of what I was dealing with, and protect my children above all else. Little did I know that this decision would lead me into a battle against not just my unfaithful wife, but against a corrupt system designed to favor those willing to play dirty games. What I discovered in the following days would shock me even more than finding her in our bed with another man. The following weeks were a masterclass in self-control. Every morning, I woke up next to Sarah, made breakfast for the kids, and went to work as if my world hadn't imploded. But beneath the surface, I was conducting the most important investigation of my life. My background in cybersecurity proved invaluable. I began monitoring our joint accounts, tracking unusual expenditures, and documenting Sarah's increasingly erratic behavior. What I discovered made my blood run cold. She had been systematically moving money from our joint savings into accounts I couldn't access. Designer clothes appeared in her closet, items that cost more than most people's monthly salary. She took mysterious trips for work conferences that didn't exist, and her phone bills showed hundreds of calls to numbers I didn't recognize. I'll never forget the conversation I overheard through our baby monitor, which I had strategically repositioned in our living room. Sarah and Richard were discussing their strategy to ensure she would get everything in the divorce. "The judge owes me favors," Richard's voice crackled through the speaker. "Harold Steinberg has been a friend for 20 years. With the right story about David being an absent father and a workaholic, we can paint him as neglectful. You'll get the house, majority custody, and substantial alimony." Sarah's laughter still echoes in my nightmares. "He has no idea what's coming. By the time we're done, he'll be lucky to see the kids every other weekend." They were right about one thing: I had no idea what was coming, but neither did they. Living in this small Texas city where everyone knows everyone, word travels fast. I started noticing how some neighbors looked at me differently, how conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Richard had been spreading rumors about me being an unfit father and husband long before any divorce papers were filed. Quick question for our touching stories family: have you ever felt completely powerless against corruption? What city are you watching from? Drop the name in the comments below. Sometimes knowing you're not alone in facing impossible battles makes all the difference. The psychological warfare was relentless. Sarah began documenting everything. If I was 5 minutes late picking up the kids, she'd text herself a concerned message. If I raised my voice even slightly during an argument, she'd write in a journal about feeling unsafe. She was building a case against me, brick by brick, lie by lie, but to could play this game. I started my own documentation process, but with the thoroughness of someone who understood that details matter. Every interaction was time-stamped and recorded where legally permissible. Every financial transaction was catalogued. Every inconsistency in her stories was noted. Most importantly, I began building a network of allies who could testify to my character and involvement as a father. My children's teachers, soccer coaches, pediatrician, and even neighbors who witnessed my daily involvement in Emma and Jake's lives became unwitting participants in my defense strategy. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March. Sarah announced she was filing for divorce, but she did it in front of the children. Emma started crying, and Jake just stared at the floor. Watching my children's hearts break while Sarah maintained her cold demeanor was the moment I realized I wasn't just fighting for assets, I was fighting for their future. That night, after the kids were asleep, I made a call that would change everything. I contacted Margaret Chen, a family law attorney known for taking on impossible cases and winning. Her reputation was stellar, but her fees were astronomical. It would mean liquidating my retirement savings and taking a second mortgage on the house, but some battles are worth every penny. What she told me in our first meeting would shake me to my core. David, Margaret said, reviewing the documents I brought, what you've gathered here is impressive, but we're facing an uphill battle. Judge Steinberg believes children belong with their mothers, period. She paused, choosing her words carefully. There's something else you need to know. Richard Blackwood and Harold Steinberg aren't just colleagues, they're old friends positioning each other for bigger things. This case isn't just about your divorce, it's about politics and favors. My heart sank. I was walking into a rigged game where the house always wins, but Margaret wasn't finished. However, she said with a slight smile, I've been practicing family law for 22 years. I've seen corrupt judges before, and I know how to work around them. The key is making everything so public and well documented that they can't ignore the facts without exposing themselves. Our strategy became multi-pronged. First, we would request a change of venue, arguing that Richard's relationship with Judge Steinberg created a conflict of interest. Second, we would file for immediate temporary custody arrangements, forcing Sarah to reveal her financial situation early in the process. Third, and most importantly, we would turn my technical skills into our secret weapon. I need you to do something that might feel uncomfortable, Margaret explained. I need you to be the perfect father for the next several months. Document everything you do with your children. Every game you attend, every homework session you help with, every bedtime story you read, all of it goes into our file. The next few months were exhausting. I was working full-time, while also serving as the primary caregiver for Emma and Jake whenever they were with me. Sarah had moved out, taking an apartment closer to Richard's office, and her visits with the children became increasingly sporadic. But something beautiful happened during this period. Without the tension of a failing marriage hanging over our home, my relationship with my children deepened. Emma, who had always been shy, began opening up about her feelings regarding the divorce. Jake, my little athlete, started looking forward to our weekend adventures more than his video games. They didn't know they were helping me build a custody case, they just knew that Dad was present, engaged, and fighting for them. The preliminary hearings began in July. Judge Steinberg's courtroom was exactly what I'd expected: imposing, traditional, with the kind of atmosphere that made you feel small and insignificant. Richard Blackwood commanded the space like he owned it, and perhaps he did. Sarah took the stand first, and her performance was Oscar-worthy. She spoke about feeling abandoned during our marriage, about my obsession with work, and about her fears that I wasn't stable following our separation. She had transformed from the woman I'd loved into a stranger I barely recognized. Your Honor, she said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "I just want what's best for our children. David has always been a provider, but he's never been a nurturer. The children need stability, and I can give them that." Judge Steinberg nodded sympathetically, asking follow-up questions that seemed designed to reinforce Sarah's narrative. When Richard presented financial documents showing my higher income, the judge actually frowned, as if earning more money was somehow evidence of neglect. When it was my turn to testify, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Judge Steinberg's questions were sharp, skeptical, and seemed designed to trap me rather than elicit truth. He interrupted me multiple times, dismissed my evidence of Sarah's infidelity as irrelevant to custody matters, and made it clear that he viewed me as exactly what Sarah had painted: a workaholic father who thought money could replace presence. I left that first hearing feeling defeated. Margaret tried to reassure me that preliminary hearings often went badly, but I could see the concern in her eyes. We were losing, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. But what happened next changed everything. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Emma, during one of our weekend movie nights, casually mentioned that Mommy's friend Richard had been bringing her expensive gifts, jewelry, electronics, things that were inappropriate for a child. "Daddy," Emma said, curled up next to me on the couch, "why does Mommy's friend buy me things? It makes me uncomfortable." My blood ran cold. They were using my children as props in their relationship, and worse, they were making Emma uncomfortable in the process. Here's a question that keeps me up at night when you see a child being manipulated. What's your first instinct? Let me know in the comments. I started paying closer attention to what Emma and Jake told me about their time with Sarah. Jake mentioned that Richard was always there when they visited Mommy's apartment. Emma said they went on expensive trips where she and Jake had to stay in their room while the adults had grown up time, but the smoking gun came from a source I never could have predicted. Sarah's sister, Linda, reached out to me through Facebook. Linda and Sarah had been estranged for years, but she had been watching the divorce proceedings with growing concern. "David," she wrote, "I need to tell you something about Sarah that you probably don't know. She's done this before. We met at a coffee shop away from prying eyes." Linda was nervous, constantly checking over her shoulder. Sarah's first marriage ended the same way. She had an affair with her divorce attorney, manipulated the system to get everything, and left her first husband with nothing. This was information that had never come up in our 12-year marriage. Sarah had always presented her first marriage as a young mistake that ended amicably. "There's more," Linda continued. "She's been planning this divorce for over 2 years. She researched judges, studied custody laws, and even took acting classes to improve her courtroom performance." Acting classes. The woman I'd watched sob convincingly on the witness stand had literally practiced her performance. But what Linda told me next would blow this case wide open. Linda provided me with documents she'd secretly copied, emails discussing strategy, receipts for the acting classes, even a handwritten journal where Sarah practiced different versions of her testimony. Most damning was a series of text messages between Sarah and a friend where she admitted that she'd felt nothing for our children, but knew they were her ticket to financial security. Reading those messages was like being stabbed in the heart. Emma and Jake weren't her children to love and protect, they were assets to be leveraged. Michael Harrison, Sarah's first husband, had been so destroyed by his divorce that he'd moved to Colorado and started over. But Linda convinced him that helping me might prevent other families from suffering the same fate. "She's not just greedy," Michael told me during our video call, "she's a sociopath. She feels no empathy for the people she hurts, including her own children. You're not fighting a person, you're fighting a predator." But I was about to discover that Sarah and Richard weren't working alone. Armed with this new information, Margaret and I developed a strategy that would expose not just Sarah's lies, but the entire corrupt network she was operating within. We had evidence of judicial bias, attorney misconduct, and systematic fraud. "We need to set traps that they'll walk into willingly," Margaret explained during one of our strategy sessions. Our first move was requesting psychological evaluations by an independent expert. Sarah would resist because she understood her own mental state better than anyone. As predicted, Richard fought the motion vigorously, but Margaret had chosen her timing perfectly. The evaluations were ordered. While we waited, I continued my investigation with Private Detective Thomas Rodriguez, a former FBI agent. What he uncovered was staggering. Sarah and Richard weren't just having an affair, they were running a sophisticated scheme to defraud wealthy divorcing husbands. They had successfully executed this plan at least 4 times over the past 5 years, always using Judge Steinberg's courtroom. They made one mistake, Thomas explained. They got greedy. The amounts of money involved are large enough to trigger federal attention. The psychological evaluation results arrived on a Thursday morning. Dr. Patricia Williams' report on Sarah was devastating. Subject displays marked narcissistic tendencies, limited empathy for others including her children, and concerning manipulative behavior. But the report on me was even more important. Subject demonstrates strong emotional intelligence, consistent dedication to his children's welfare, and no indicators of alleged behavioral issues. When these results were filed, I watched Richard's confident demeanor crack for the first time. The what happened next would turn this case into a media sensation. October brought a development that would change everything. Richard Blackwood made a critical error. He filed a motion requesting that I undergo a comprehensive financial audit, alleging I was hiding assets offshore. It was a desperate move, but what Richard didn't know was that I had been hoping he would make exactly this request. Perfect, Margaret said, when she saw the motion. He just gave us legal authority to examine everyone's finances, including Sarah's and his own. We immediately filed our own motion requesting complete financial disclosure from all parties, including Richard's law firm's records. The look on Richard's face when he realized what he'd done was priceless. He had walked directly into our trap. While our forensic accountant began the investigation, I received an unexpected phone call that would provide the final piece of our puzzle. Jennifer Walsh, a paralegal who had recently quit Richard's firm, was nervous but determined. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "I think you should know that what's happening to you isn't an isolated incident. I have emails where they discuss specific cases and how much they need to charge to make their arrangement profitable. They call it the family business." The emails Jennifer provided were explosive. One exchange showed Richard and Judge Steinberg discussing how to manage cases to ensure specific outcomes. Another showed Sarah receiving coaching on testimony. But the most damning evidence was a spreadsheet showing proceeds from successful divorce manipulations, with money flowing into offshore accounts controlled by Richard and Sarah jointly. They weren't just having an affair, they were running an organized criminal enterprise. Have you ever uncovered corruption that ran deeper than you imagined? What was your reaction? Tell me in the comments. Why are you coming forward now? I asked Jennifer. Because I have a daughter, she replied. And I realized that if this happened to you, it could happen to any family. Margaret immediately recognized the significance. David, this changes everything. We're not just fighting a custody battle, we're exposing systematic corruption. The trial was scheduled for November 15th, and everything we had worked for would come down to a few crucial days. As the trial date approached, Emma's teacher approached me at a school event. "Mr. Mitchell, I don't know what's happening in your legal case, but Emma has never been happier or more confident. Whatever you're doing as a father, it's working, but I knew that without legal victory, I might lose the chance to continue being the father my children deserved." What happened in that courtroom would shock everyone. November 15th dawned gray and cold. I had been waiting for this day for 8 months, and nothing was going to keep me away from that courtroom. The courthouse was buzzing with activity. Word had spread that this case would be more than routine divorce proceedings. Margaret had strategically leaked just enough information to generate interest from local media and other attorneys. Judge Steinberg's courtroom was packed. Sarah entered looking like the perfect victim: conservative dress, minimal makeup, brave vulnerability that she had clearly practiced. Richard was in his element, exuding confidence. But I noticed something different in Judge Steinberg's demeanor. He was paying attention without his usual obvious bias. Our preliminary motions had put him on notice that this case was being watched. Sarah took the stand first and delivered a performance worthy of daytime television. She spoke about feeling abandoned, about my obsessive work habits, and about her fear that the children were being used as pawns. "He was never there for the small moments," Sarah said, dabbing her eyes. "Birthday parties, school plays, bedtime stories, I handled all of that alone. It was compelling, except it was completely false." Margaret's cross-examination was deliberately understated, focusing on basic timeline issues. To observers, it might have seemed weak, but I knew she was setting up for later revelations. The second day began with character witnesses for Sarah, friends who testified about her devotion to the children. Each witness seemed genuine, which made sense since they had no idea they were supporting a carefully constructed lie. But then Margaret called Dr. Patricia Williams, the court-appointed psychologist, and the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Based on my evaluation, Dr. Williams testified, Ms. Mitchell shows significant indicators of narcissistic personality disorder, including lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, and a transactional view of relationships, including with her children. Richard objected repeatedly, but Judge Steinberg overruled him. The evaluation had been his court's idea. The real shock came when Dr. Williams discussed her evaluation of the children. Emma and Jake both expressed concerns about their mother's behavior and her relationship with Mr. Blackwood. They described feeling uncomfortable with expensive gifts and being asked to keep secrets. The courtroom was dead silent. Sarah's face had gone pale. That's when Margaret delivered our first major revelation about the children's discomfort with Richard's inappropriate behavior toward them. Judge Steinberg was no longer nodding sympathetically. For the first time, he looked uncertain about the narrative he'd been accepting. The what came next would blow this case wide open. He was paying attention, but not with his usual obvious bias. Margaret's preliminary motions had put him on notice that this case was being watched. Margaret's opening statement was deliberately understated. She outlined our basic position that I was a devoted father who deserved equal custody and a fair division of assets without revealing the bombshell evidence we were prepared to present. The first day of testimony followed the script everyone expected. Sarah took the stand and delivered a performance worthy of daytime television. She spoke about feeling abandoned during our marriage, about my obsessive work habits, and about her fear that the children were being used as pawns in my attempt to avoid paying fair support. He was never there for the small moments, Sarah said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Birthday parties, school plays, bedtime stories, I handled all of that alone while he was locked in his office working. It was a compelling narrative, except for one problem: it was completely false. But Richard had coached her well, and Judge Steinberg was nodding sympathetically. When Margaret cross-examined Sarah, she kept her questions simple and non-threatening, focusing on basic timeline issues and asking for clarification on dates and events. To an observer, it might have seemed like a weak performance, but I knew she was setting up for later revelations. The second day began with character witnesses for Sarah, friends who testified about her devotion to the children and her struggles during our marriage. Each witness seemed genuine and concerned, which made sense since they had no idea they were supporting a carefully constructed lie. But then Margaret called her first witness, and the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically. Dr. Patricia Williams, the court-appointed psychologist, took the stand with her comprehensive evaluation reports. Under Margaret's questioning, she methodically destroyed the image Sarah had been trying to project. Based on my evaluation, Dr. Williams testified, Ms. Mitchell shows significant indicators of narcissistic personality disorder, including lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, and an transactional view of relationships, including her relationship with her children. Richard objected repeatedly, but Judge Steinberg overruled him each time. The psychological evaluation had been his idea, and he couldn't exclude evidence from his own court-appointed expert. But the real shock came when Margaret asked Dr. Williams about her evaluation of the children. Emma and Jake both expressed concerns about their mother's behavior and her relationship with Mr. Blackwood. They described feeling uncomfortable with expensive gifts and being asked to keep secrets about activities at their mother's apartment. The courtroom was dead silent. Sarah's face had gone pale, and Richard was frantically taking notes, trying to figure out how to manage this unexpected development. That's when Margaret delivered the first of our major revelations. Dr. Williams, did the children mention anything about their mother's relationship with her attorney? Yes. Both children indicated they were confused about the nature of the relationship between their mother and Mr. Blackwood, and Emma specifically mentioned feeling uncomfortable when they were together. Judge Steinberg was no longer nodding sympathetically. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked uncertain about the narrative he'd been accepting. Day 3 was when we began unleashing the evidence that would change everything. Margaret started with the financial records, methodically showing how Sarah had been moving marital assets into accounts controlled jointly with Richard Blackwood. Your Honor, Margaret said, displaying a chart on the screen, these records show systematic asset concealment totaling over $300,000 in marital funds transferred without Mr. Mitchell's knowledge. But that was just the beginning. Thomas Rodriguez, our private investigator, took the stand with evidence that made people in the courtroom gasp. Using bank records and surveillance footage, it documented Sarah and Richard's affair going back 18 months, 6 months longer than Sarah had admitted under oath. But more importantly, Thomas testified, "My investigation revealed this pattern matches at least for other divorce cases handled by Mr. Blackwood in Judge Steinberg's courtroom over the past 5 years." Richard jumped to his feet. "Objection. This is irrelevant." Judge Steinberg looked uncomfortable, but couldn't ignore the evidence. "I'll allow it," Thomas continued. "In each case, the pattern was identical: an affair between the female plaintiff and Mr. Blackwood, systematic asset concealment, character assassination of the husband, and settlements far above normal ranges." The courtroom was buzzing. Reporters were furiously typing on their phones. Quick question: when you see a pattern of corruption this clear, what's the first thing that goes through your mind? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Margaret called Jennifer Walsh to the stand. Jennifer was nervous, but determined as she revealed the organizational structure of what she called the family business. Mr. Blackwood would identify wealthy men going through marital difficulties, Jennifer testified. Then he would arrange to meet their wives, offering legal services, while simultaneously beginning personal relationships. Margaret then introduced the explosive emails Jennifer had provided, reading excerpts that showed explicit coordination between Richard and Judge Steinberg on case outcomes. "Your Honor," Margaret said, "I'm mentoring evidence that demonstrates systematic judicial misconduct and attorney fraud spanning multiple years and cases." The silence was deafening. Richard's face had gone from pale to bright red. Judge Steinberg looked like a man watching his career collapse in real time. But the most damning moment came when Margaret called Michael Harrison via video from Colorado. Sarah's first husband appeared on screen, and his testimony was devastating. "I lost everything in my divorce to Sarah," Michael said, his voice strong despite obvious emotion. "My house, my savings, my relationship with my stepchildren, almost my sanity." The same attorney, the same judge, the same lies. As Michael spoke, I watched Sarah's carefully constructed facade finally crumble. She wasn't crying tears of victimhood anymore, she was crying because her scheme had been exposed. Margaret's final witness was the most powerful of all. She called Emma to testify. At 10 years old, Emma was old enough to understand and articulate her feelings. Under gentle questioning, Emma described her relationship with both parents. "I love both my mommy and daddy," Emma said, her small voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "But I feel safer with daddy. He listens to me, helps with homework, and doesn't make me keep secrets." When Margaret asked about Richard's presence, Emma's discomfort was obvious. "Mommy's friend buys me expensive things, but it makes me feel weird. He asks me not to tell daddy, and he and mommy act different when they think me and Jake aren't watching." Judge Steinberg couldn't look at Emma while she testified. The 10-year-old girl was single-handedly destroying the narrative he had been prepared to support. In a moment that still gives me chills, Emma looked directly at the judge and said, "I just want to live with a parent who makes me feel safe and loved. That's my daddy." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the heating system running. Sarah was sobbing, not practiced tears, but tears of shame and defeat. As Emma stepped down and hugged my waist, whispering, "I love you, Daddy," I knew we had won more than a legal case. We had won the right to protect my children's future. But what Judge Steinberg said next shocked everyone in that courtroom. The final day of trial was unlike anything I could have imagined. Judge Steinberg entered looking like a man who had aged a decade overnight. The evidence had not just exposed Sarah and Richard's scheme, it had implicated him in systematic corruption. Richard's closing argument was desperate, trying to argue that his relationship with Sarah was irrelevant, that evidence of other cases was prejudicial, that I was simply vindictive. But his performance lacked confidence. The jury of public opinion was clearly against him. Margaret's closing argument was a masterpiece. She systematically reviewed our evidence, connecting each revelation to protecting Emma and Jake from further manipulation. "Your Honor," Margaret said, with absolute moral certainty, "this case has revealed systematic fraud, judicial corruption, and the exploitation of children for financial gain. Emma and Jake deserve protection from this toxic environment, and David Mitchell deserves justice." Judge Steinberg took a 30-minute recess. When he returned, he looked directly at me for the first time during the entire proceeding. "This court has reviewed all evidence presented," he began, his voice lacking its usual authority. "In the matter of custody, I award primary physical custody of Emma and Jake Mitchell to their father, David Mitchell, With supervised visitation rights to Sarah Mitchell, the courtroom erupted in whispers, but Judge Steinberg wasn't finished. Regarding division of assets, Sarah Mitchell's concealment of marital property and fraudulent conduct has forfeited her right to spousal support. David Mitchell shall retain the family home, his retirement accounts, and vehicles. Sarah Mitchell shall return all concealed assets. Sarah collapsed into Richard's arms, sobbing. But these weren't practiced tears, these were tears of someone watching their world crumble. Judge Steinberg's final statement was the most satisfying moment of the entire ordeal. This court is referring evidence of potential criminal conduct to the district attorney's office. Mr. Blackwood, you are hereby barred from appearing in my courtroom pending ethics charges. As we left the courthouse, Emma holding one hand and Jake holding the other, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year. Hope. Tell me in the comments, have you ever witnessed justice being served after thinking all was lost? What was that moment like for you? But the story wasn't over yet. The real consequences were just beginning. Your Honor, Margaret said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute moral certainty, this case has revealed something far more serious than a contentious divorce. We have uncovered systematic fraud, judicial corruption, and the exploitation of children for financial gain. Emma and Jake Mitchell deserve protection from this toxic environment, and David Mitchell deserves justice after being victimized by an organized scheme designed to destroy families for profit. She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering her final statement. The evidence is overwhelming. Sarah Mitchell committed perjury on multiple occasions, concealed marital assets, and prioritized her criminal relationship over her children's welfare. Richard Blackwood violated every ethical standard of the legal profession. And most importantly, Emma and Jake have clearly expressed their preference to live with their father, the parent who has consistently put their needs first. Judge Steinberg took a 30-minute recess before returning with his decision. When he re-entered the courtroom, he looked directly at me for the first time during the entire proceeding. This court has reviewed all evidence presented, he began, his voice lacking its usual authoritative tone. In the matter of custody, I award primary physical custody of Emma and Jake Mitchell to their father, David Mitchell, with supervised visitation rights to Sarah Mitchell. The courtroom erupted in whispers, but Judge Steinberg wasn't finished. Regarding division of assets, Sarah Mitchell's concealment of marital property and fraudulent conduct has forfeited her right to spousal support. David Mitchell shall retain the family home, his retirement accounts, and the vehicles in his name. Sarah Mitchell shall return all concealed assets to the marital estate. Sarah collapsed into Richard's arms, sobbing. But these weren't the practiced tears she had used during her testimony, these were tears of someone watching their entire world crumble. Judge Steinberg's final statement was the most satisfying moment of the entire ordeal. This court is also referring evidence of potential criminal conduct to the district attorney's office for investigation. Mr. Blackwood, you are hereby barred from appearing in my courtroom pending resolution of ethics charges that will be filed with the state bar. As we left the courthouse that day, Emma holding one hand and Jake holding the other, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year. Hope for the future. But the story wasn't over yet. 3 months after our victory in court, the ripple effects were still being felt throughout Austin's legal community. Richard Blackwood was facing disbarment proceedings and criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy. Judge Steinberg had announced his early retirement, citing health concerns, though everyone knew the real reason. Most importantly, Sarah was facing her own reckoning. The district attorney had filed charges against her for perjury, asset concealment, and fraud. The other victims Richard and Sarah had targeted over the years were coming forward, and a class action lawsuit was forming. But for me, the real victory was watching my children heal and thrive in the stable environment we had fought so hard to preserve. Emma had started taking piano lessons and was excelling in school. Her confidence had returned, and she no longer flinched when adults asked her questions about her family situation. Jake had joined the Little League team and was making friends with kids whose parents actually wanted to get to know me, rather than avoid me based on rumors and lies. Sarah's supervised visitations were sporadic and awkward. The court-appointed supervisor noted that she seemed more interested in her phone than interacting with Emma and Jake. Eventually, she moved to Dallas, claiming she needed a fresh start. Her visits became monthly, then quarterly, then stopped altogether. It was heartbreaking to watch my children process their mother's abandonment, but it also confirmed that we had made the right decision in fighting for custody. Sarah had never been interested in being a parent. She had only been interested in the financial benefits parenthood could provide. The media attention our case received led to reform discussions in family court procedures. New rules were implemented requiring disclosure of personal relationships between attorneys and judges, and several other judges announced they would recuse themselves from cases involving attorneys they had personal relationships with. Most gratifyingly, Michael Harrison moved back to Austin. He had followed our case from Colorado and was inspired by our victory to rebuild his life in the city he had been forced to leave. We became friends, bonding over our shared experience and commitment to helping other fathers navigate similar challenges. Perhaps the most important lesson I learned through this ordeal was about the power of patience, preparation, and persistence. When I first discovered Sarah's betrayal, every instinct told me to confront her immediately, to explode in righteous anger, to demand immediate justice. Instead, I chose to gather information, build alliances, and trust the process even when that process seemed rigged against me. That decision made all the difference between losing everything and gaining justice from my family. Now I want to hear from you, our Touching Stories community. What city are you watching from? Your support throughout this journey has meant everything to me and my children. Drop your city name in the comments. I'd love to know how far our story has reached and where our fellow fighters for justice are located. 6 months after the trial, I received a letter that brought tears to my eyes. It was from another father in Houston who had been following our story through local media coverage. He was facing a similar situation with a corrupt attorney and biased judge, and our case had given him the courage and strategy to fight back. Your story saved my family, he wrote. I'm using your playbook, and I'm winning. Thank you for showing that the system can be beaten when good people refuse to give up. That letter made every sleepless night, every dollar spent on legal fees, and every moment of doubt worthwhile. If our story could help even one other family avoid the destruction Sarah and Richard had planned for us, then all the pain had served a purpose. Today, Emma is 13 and Jake is 11. They're thriving academically, socially, and emotionally. They understand what happened during the divorce in age-appropriate terms, and they're proud of how their father fought to protect them. Emma recently told me, "Daddy, I'm glad you didn't give up on us when everyone said you should." Sometimes the greatest victories come not from what we win, but from what we refuse to lose. I refuse to lose my children, my dignity, and my faith in justice, and that refusal change everything. For any parent facing a similar battle, remember this: document everything, trust your instincts, surround yourself with ethical professionals, and never stop fighting for your children. The system may be flawed, but it's not unbeatable. Justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it's justice prepared. And when justice finally arrives, it's worth every sacrifice you made to achieve it. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Touching Stories. If this story resonated with you, please share it with others who might need to hear that fighting for what's right is always worth it. Remember, you're stronger than you think, and you're never fighting alone.